Okay, so officially welcome to our December webinar. This evening we will be talking about habit reversal training for skin picking. As every time, I'm Vladimir. I will be giving you the webinar, and then afterwards we will have the Q&A that we always have. I'm going to try and make this webinar as practical as possible because my idea is to give you a basic outline of how to do habit reversal training, even if you're not seeing a therapist or if you're not in our program. So it's something that you can hopefully implement on your own. As I go through the slides, I will try to give practical tips, but if there's something that remains unclear or you're not sure how to apply something or how to get started, use the Q&A part on your screens and then ask a question, and we'll get to all of them afterwards. So let's get started. Okay, so as you know, I always try to put art that somehow relates to the topic. I have to say this time I just put pieces of art that I would like to have on my walls if I had an unlimited budget, if I actually had an art budget, because believe it or not, artists were not inspired by habit reversal training, and there was nothing sort of topical that I could put. So here's what we'll be talking about tonight. So first we will define what habit reversal training is. We will talk a little bit about what is it used for and what is it you can hope to achieve with it. Then we will go through each stage of habit reversal training. And I will explain what the purpose of each of them is and how to work with it. We'll talk about habit reversal as part of the Skin Pick program. And then I will give you some tips for those of you that are trying to do this alone. So how to get started and what are some of the things that you should maybe avoid and what to pay attention to. And then we'll talk about the limitations of habit reversal training. As any form of treatment, this one is not all powerful and good for everything. So I think it's very important to know what is it that you can get with habit reversal and what is it that you cannot get, so that you know exactly how to set your expectations. And then afterwards, we'll go to the Q&A. I wanted to let you know before we proceed that most of you have already voted for the topic for December. If you haven't already, check the poll and just select whatever it is that you would like to hear. Currently, from what I can see, emotional avoidance is leading, but that can change. So let's get started. Okay, I'll just move myself to the left. Okay, so what exactly is habit reversal training? So it's a form of behavioral treatment. It's a behavioral intervention, let's say, specifically designed to deal with repetitive behaviors. So things like skin picking or hair pulling or nail biting or thumb sucking or tics or TMJ disorder or stuttering. As a therapist, I've used it for most of these. I've never used it for stuttering, and I'm not really quite sure how I would apply it, although there have been studies that show that it's effective. And I've never used it for TMJ disorder for the simple fact that no one has ever asked me to. It can be used as a standalone treatment, or as is more common these days, it's used as a part of something else. So mostly it's incorporated in other forms of cognitive behavioral therapy. Specifically in Skin Pick, we use it in association with acceptance and commitment therapy. There's a specific form of habit reversal training that's called decoupling, and it's basically habit reversal that's turned into a form of self-help. So it's a kind of HRT that you can do on your own. What I will show today here will be a mix of the two. It's been empirically shown to be beneficial for skin picking. So if my memory serves me right, this has been empirically validated back in the 70s even. It's possibly the first form of treatment that's been shown to be effective for skin picking. To this day, you have most studies dealing with this form of therapy. And the reason for it is that it's practical and it's rather simple. It's not necessarily easy, but it is rather simple. So here are the stages of habit reversal training. The first stage is the awareness training, and then there's response training, and then there are compliance, relaxation, and generalization training. So if you ask me, practically speaking, you actually need to know only the first two components. So awareness training and response training. Everything else is more like a facet of the process or something that comes complementary or that should accompany the process, but these are not successive stages. So the only properly successive stages are awareness training and response training. Everything else can and should be done from the very beginning. So keep that in mind as we go forward. Let's start with the first stage right away. So and then let me move myself to the right. When I don't turn the camera on, people tell me I should do that, but when I do, I'm always blocking either the text or the artwork, and I don't know which bugs me more. So the first stage is the awareness training stage. This is, according to me, is the most important stage that you will have, for the simple reason that what you work with in later stages is what you learn about in the awareness training stage. You cannot apply techniques unless you're aware that you're about to pick or that you're picking. So awareness needs to come first, and then everything else. When I work with people, one of the first things that they try to do is skip, accelerate, or somehow avoid or shorten the awareness training stage. People usually think of it as I'm doing nothing in particular, even though you're really doing the most important part. You're laying the foundations for the whole process. So awareness training is basically a part of the treatment where you learn about skin picking. You learn how to identify triggers. You learn how to identify contexts where you pick, and you learn how to identify your emotional responses and your thought patterns. Why is this important? In order to prevent or predict picking, you need to understand what will trigger it, especially if picking is mindless, sort of unconscious. This stage is even more important because you need to become aware of it in order to deal with it. Very often as people go through awareness training, they have this feeling that they're picking more. And this happens quite frequently in the early stages of the program, that people will send me a message and then say things like, well, I think I'm picking even more now than I did a week ago. And this is because you're not picking more, you're just becoming more aware of picking. So you're kind of starting to understand the actual scope of the problem. So how do you go about building awareness? The most basic tool that everyone will tell you to use is some form of self-monitoring. SkinPick has an app that you can use for free, and it's a rather good detailed way to self-monitor. You can create a spreadsheet for yourself, you can journal about it, you can do whatever feels right for you. I personally like to recommend the app because it makes you enter a lot of information, which means that you will have to reflect on your experience, which means that you will learn more about it. So the way that you become aware is by kind of zooming into different aspects of your experience. And the app really guides you through that process. The second thing why I think the app is good is because if you journal, you don't carry around your journal everywhere. So you can't really just, if you're at work, you can't just drop everything, open your journal, and then start writing. But with the phone, it's very easy to take your phone out and just enter some basic information. So it allows you to monitor yourself in real time, which is absolutely the best way to do self-monitoring. The second thing that you can do is implement mindfulness, both formal and informal. Formal mindfulness is when you sit a certain number of minutes every day and then practice a kind of mindfulness. Since we're talking about awareness training and skin picking, I guess the most logical type of mindfulness to practice would be body scanning, because that way you're learning to turn your attention inward to your body and to listen to what's happening in it, which is how you notice the urges arising or tension accumulating and all these things. Second type of mindfulness that you can use is informal mindfulness. This is very helpful if you already have an idea about the contexts in which you pick. So if you know, for example, that you pick while you watch TV, what you can do is give yourself a task to be mindful of your hands the whole time. So you're watching TV, but you're still focusing on your hands or on your face or whatever you think is the most, the best place to be focused on. So that would be informal mindfulness. It's bringing mindfulness into already existing activities. If you can combine the two, that's perfect. You can have accountability partners. I will talk about them a little later, but for now, these would be, for specific purposes at this stage, these would be people who are around you while you pick and people you trust. So this is very important. For example, if you live with your partner, parents, grandparents, roommates, it doesn't matter. If you don't trust them, it's maybe for the best that they're not your accountability partners. But if you do believe that they can point it out in a way that you don't find to be aggressive or judgmental, and if you can hear their words in a way that doesn't hurt you, then they're really good for it. So that you can find a code word or a gesture or something so that they can point out that you're picking. That way you will have someone external to raise your awareness. And then once they point it out, you can see why is it you're picking. So look at your surroundings, look at what you're feeling, and look at what you're thinking. Those of you who are in the program with me, or I suppose with others as well, but I can only speak for me, is that I always ask you to enter emotional responses and thought patterns. This is sometimes very difficult to identify, and it's a testament to why awareness training is so crucial. Some of your triggers will be external, meaning you will be triggered by, I don't know, a certain person or your workload or a conversation you have to have, something along those lines. For example, last week, as you can guess, what the most triggering thing was recently. So it was the elections, for example. That was a major external trigger for a lot of my clients. However, some of the triggers are internal. If you find yourself picking, but you cannot associate it to anything that's happening around you, then you turn your attention to your emotions and your thoughts. Because people will often say there are no triggers for my picking. This is, of course, impossible. There is no behavior that doesn't arise because of something, right? There's no uncaused anything in the human psyche. I suppose, unless you're God, you're caused by something. So picking is caused by something. If you cannot detect anything external, look at thoughts, look at emotions. If you're having a hard time putting verbal labels to your emotions, that's okay. You don't really have to have conventional names for them. So you don't have to identify something as anxiety or guilt or threat, fear, whatever. You can simply map out what's happening in your body or connect what you're feeling with certain thoughts, and then come up with your own name. It doesn't really matter how you call it. It's only important that you recognize it. And thought patterns are perhaps easier to recognize than emotions are. So I will sometimes tell people just write down the last thought that you can remember before picking. So, and also when you do awareness training, please take time. In the Skin Pick program, it takes about 2 weeks. Although after that period, I will usually direct people to do self-monitoring in a specific aspect. So I will say, focus on unconscious picking, or I will single out a context that's particularly troubling or certain behaviors that are troubling. So I will narrow it down, but I really suggest that people do awareness training as long as they can. Because you can really never learn enough. And also just being aware is sometimes enough for you to stop. So please don't skip this stage. It's very important. But let's say after a couple of weeks of self-monitoring, you are typically ready to go on to the next stage, which is a stage which is called response training. This is when you review your logs and try, based on these logs, you select 2 sets of techniques. You select your competing responses and you select your stimulus control technique. Competing responses are, you may have, if you've been to our previous webinars and if you sort of listen through the Q&A section, you might know about competing responses already. So these are basically competing habits. So new habits that you introduce in order to replace picking. The goal is to minimize damage and to see if you can establish a degree of control over picking, but a control that is slightly different. You don't control whether or not you have the urge to pick. So you don't try to kind of overpower your body. You're actually just kind of redirecting the urge. So it is control, but it's also not control. It's a different kind of control. An example of a competing response would be, let's say, to kind of interlock your hands, or to sit on your hands, or to do a breathing exercise, or use a squeeze toy, or some kind of fidget. So anything that would work for you. I've noticed two types of diverging strategies that are both dysfunctional, and I kind of have to point them out right now. One is a tendency to select like 36 competing responses. I'm, of course, not really serious. No one selects 36 of them, but people will select 10 easily. Why is this a problem? It essentially means that you have to incorporate 10 new habits in your behavior. To be successful with any of them would be a minor miracle. So this is not a good strategy. It's not a good way to go about it. On the other hand, people will sometimes just choose one. They will say, I will close my eyes for 10 seconds when I have to pick. Chances that one new habit, especially one that's not as engaging, such as closing your eyes, for it to cover all the situations where you pick, this is also not very likely. So to choose one doesn't work, to choose 20 doesn't work. Ideally, you will start with one competing response per context in which you pick. So if you pick, let's say, at home and at work, start with two. One for work, one for home. The way you choose them is not what's most convenient for you. You choose them based on what your triggers are, where you are, who's around you. So for example, at work, if one of your triggers, let's say, is just interacting with colleagues or speaking in front of people, some competing responses might be inappropriate. So if you have a meeting, you can't exactly just, open your bag, take out a fidget spinner and then just use that. So that wouldn't work. But if you're in a meeting, then maybe interlocking your fingers might work, because this is not a particularly controversial gesture. Like, it's not something that people single you out for or point out or even notice. But then if you're at home, you can use competing responses that are different. I also recommend that once you start, you use competing responses that are physical objects. It may not always be possible, but if it is possible, go with that. The reason is that it's a new habit, so you need to remember to use it. If you say, I will do deep breathing for 2 minutes, that's really nice and lovely, but you don't have a physical reminder to do that. But if you have a object in front of you, so let's say you pick in front of the TV, and then you put stress balls around the TV, so you have a visual cue to remind you to actually use them. Competing responses are something that you have to practice. So even if you don't feel the urge to pick, in the response training stage, you're supposed to use them. If you need tips on how to build new habits, go to our, that will be September webinar, I think, on YouTube. So it's there, and you can learn about how to form habits and what are the best ways and what to avoid. I don't want to go into details of that. If you have questions, you can ask in the Q&A, but now I don't want to burden the webinar with that. So the point is that it's a habit to introduce. So you have to be very intentional about it. Second group of techniques are stimulus control techniques. So those are basically all the interventions you can do on your environment or even on your body that will minimize or remove triggers. So a competing response is something that will help you redirect the urge once it arises. Stimulus control is supposed to prevent the urge from arising. And then when you combine these two, ideally, you should be able to cover everything important about picking. An example of a stimulus control technique would be, let's say, to avoid mirrors, or to dim the lights in the bathroom, or to cover the mirrors, or to use a timer in the bathroom. Some stimulus control techniques that work very well, but people tend to resist them, are like, for example, wearing gloves. Gloves are unusually effective, but whenever I suggest them, people will immediately say, well, I live in a hot climate. Or they will say, that's not comfortable, or I can't use my phone when I wear gloves, which, to be perfectly honest, I don't think is a bad thing, but there you go. All of these are usually easily solvable. There are gloves that you can wear that will allow you to use phones, and so that's all solvable. The thing is that for some reason, people feel a kind of resistance to wearing gloves. Gloves are really very effective. Gloves or finger covers or anything of that sort. So that would be an example of stimulus control as well. If you, let's say, pick your feet, wearing socks would be stimulus control. When you get to this stage in skin pick, that's session 3, there's usually like a list of 10 or 20 competing responses and also a number of stimulus control techniques for you to choose from. But what I prefer is when people actually take some time and analyze the logs again and then come up with your own responses. Because the generic ideas, I mean, they might work, but if you kind of tailor make something for yourself, it's more meaningful, you're more likely to use it, and it's also more likely to work. So just to summarize this stage briefly, when you choose your competing responses, make sure that you've already developed your awareness enough, and then make sure to choose the responses based on what you find in your logs or your journals, not based on what you think is right. One of the arguments that people often use when they start treatment with me is to say, well, we can really skip over that awareness thing because I'm a very mindful person. Well, the kind of answer for everyone is no, you're really not. Because mindful people don't really have, automatic behaviors because they're being mindful. So no one's really that mindful. In fact, if something is a problem, you really are not mindful of it. And that's a part of the problem. My point being is that don't try to skip awareness training, because without awareness training, you can't really choose the right techniques to deal with picking. So awareness, again, most important. So what do you do then? So you've selected your techniques, you've become aware of your behavior sufficiently. So now you do something that's called compliance training. So compliance training is essentially everything you have to do to make sure that you stick to the techniques that you've chosen. The first and basic thing to do is to incorporate certain reward and validation systems. Again, I would like to refer you back to the webinar Habit Formation, because I go into details there about why rewards are important and how to use rewards. Here, I would like to suggest several things. One, validate yourself every time you use a competing response. So whenever you remember to use it, give yourself some sort of small reward. I would also suggest that you use different tiers of rewards. So whenever you do something good, like an individual competing response, it's really important to acknowledge that you're doing something good for yourself. But that's not exactly the same level of achievement as when you have a day without picking or a week without picking. So make sure to select 2 or 3 different levels of rewards, but also make sure they're meaningful for you. So if there's like a guilty pleasure that you like, then reward yourself with that after, let's say, a week without picking. So it's important to have these little tiers, and it's also important to journal about them. When you're in the program or you're working with a therapist, you kind of get to talk and discuss different issues. When you're alone, it's really important to have something, I will use this term loosely, but objective, to kind of reflect back your intentions and your thoughts and also your realistic achievements. A journal is really great there. You have to be aware and follow your pace of change. So you don't change as fast as you want to change. You change as fast as you can. This is a very important point. One part of me just rambling on about how people skip awareness training is that people will say, oh, well, let's just rush through this and just do it as fast as we can. Like, let me just choose some techniques and get started with them. No matter how fast you go, you will really never go faster than you can go. If you try to rush change or habit formation or anything, what you will end up is frustration, but not success. You cannot change faster than you can change. Just like repeat that as a mantra all the time. An important component in habit reversal is patience. It's much better to go at a slower pace, but be analytical in your approach. So you will fail. That's inevitable. Everyone does at a certain point. So learn from your failures. Try to identify all points of resistance and then work around them and try to understand them. What are points of resistance? So these are all the situations where you forget conveniently about using competing responses, where suddenly you revert back to a lot of mindless, unconscious picking. Points where you consciously decide that you don't want to use a competing response and you will pick anyway. Like these moments, you can look at them as failures, or you can actually look at them as very teachable moments. Every time you choose to pick over using a competing response, this is a good moment to see why is it that picking is better than a competing response. So what is it picking does better? So you can actually learn and improve your competing responses. So not every time when you don't use a competing response, not every moment is a point of resistance. Sometimes you will truly just forget because you're human. But if you forget 4 times in a day or 5 times in a week, I'm making these numbers up, but like if it's something that happens with a degree of regularity, then it is very likely resistance. Or if you know that you have a problem that kind of makes it difficult for you to establish a habit, let's say you have ADD or ADHD or some sort of attention problem, and you do nothing to work around it, and instead say, well, I would really like to, but it's just my ADD and I just can't. That's also a point of resistance, very likely. It's like it's literally like saying, well, I'm not good at math, so why bother ever paying my taxes? You know, who's got to calculate that? You might hate math and be bad at math, or even have trouble, you know, like reading, but you can still work around the issue. The point is whether or not something is a realistic obstacle, or is it an obstacle that you're kind of using to push through your resistance. So be very mindful of these points. Journaling is also a very good way to understand these instances, because as you journal day to day, you can take certain days, like once a week, in 2 weeks, where you review everything that you wrote in your journal and try to spot patterns. Some things will not be visible in your day-to-day experience. So let's say something that might seem like forgetfulness can actually be resistance, but because every day you kind of say to yourself, oh, well, I forgot, but you know, I'll do it tomorrow. And then when you write that down 7 times, there's a pattern right there. So this is why it's important to journal if you don't have a therapist. Track the efficacy of selected techniques and then review them as needed and replace them. Certain competing responses will seem very appealing to you, but if they don't work, there's no need to keep them. On the other hand, it might be actual resistance if you use something for 2 days, forget to use it 20% of the time, and then dismiss it as useless. So give a competing response a week or so, maybe even more, I guess that depends on you, before you dismiss it as being inefficient. So ineffective, sorry. So make sure to give them a proper chance, evaluate them objectively. So either talk about it with your therapist. If you're in skin pick, check in very frequently in the worksheet 3.1 and 2, and then just journal a little bit every day or every other day. And then you will have materials to kind of use and then evaluate your techniques. This is very important. Also, the fact that something might be uncomfortable or weird doesn't make it a bad competing response. I'm saying this for a very specific reason, because today, one of the messages that I was answering on SkinPick was that one of the clients tried to use a spinner ring as a competing response at work. And as a competing response, it worked very well, but the client kept insisting on replacing it, which of course I don't mind. It's not my skin picking, it's not my skin, it's not my spinner ring, but it was a very useful response. But the client really wanted to replace it because aesthetically they didn't really like the ring. And to me, that's also a really very interesting point of resistance, because we're trying to change a habit. A ring cannot be that ugly that you can possibly, replace an effective technique because you don't like the way it looks. So that's also something to think about. I mean, these things might sound like I'm splitting hairs here and kind of going into unnecessary details, but resistance works in almost magical ways. This is why it's very important to be mindful of your own excuses and failures. So one thing that you do parallel from the beginning, so this is written as stage 4, but start with this as soon as you start with awareness training, is to do relaxation training. Skin picking often functions as a way to self-soothe or to process stress or intense emotions. And then therefore a part of treatment should be to address what picking actually does. So if self-soothing or calming or processing emotions or focusing is something that skin picking does for you, then you need to find a way to replace its function from the very beginning. Some of the ways you can do that is by using different grounding exercises or mindfulness or PMR, progressive muscle relaxation, or breathing exercises, yoga. There's just many, many things that you can implement. You can take a stress or anxiety management course. You have like MBSR, for example, mindfulness-based stress reduction is quite effective, quite demanding, and it will also teach you to meditate. So that's something that you can sign up for. I believe there are even some free online versions available. At the same time, relaxation training doesn't really have to be a specific new technique that you incorporate. Sometimes what you need is to adjust your work-life balance. So a life coach might help. Sometimes you simply need to say no to things at work, or no to your family members, or to create a space for yourself. But to give you an example that's really very banal. So a lot of my clients like to use adult coloring books or to solve puzzles. Personally, my kind of form of relaxation, aside from mindfulness, I think I talked in detail in one of the previous webinars about my personal mindfulness practice and how I do it, but that's not the only thing that I do. What I like to do is to play solitaire or patience, or however you call that game. But I don't use computers, because when I don't work, I prefer to stay away from my laptop. So I have like two decks of like these very, very old decks. So the cards are kind of used up, and they have this, like, I don't know, I really like to play with them. And then sometimes when I have time, I will make coffee, play music, and then there's this thing called the German solitaire, which is like very difficult to solve. And then that's kind of what I would do for relaxation if it's not a psychological technique. The reason why I'm giving you this as an example is because you can really find very creative ways to relax. Someone will like to paint, write, so whatever it is, but you need to implement a lot of it. So work on relaxation from the beginning. I like to advise, as probably you all know by now, I like to tell people to use mindfulness because I really think it's a useful resource. It's awareness training and relaxation training at the same time. But yoga is also something that's quite good, especially if you live a sedentary lifestyle and you sit at your computer all day or don't move around. In general, that's something that can really help. Physical exercise, also great. Breathing exercises, also very useful. So see what works for you, essentially, but implement something from the very beginning. And then once you have all these set in place, what you do is something called the generalization, or someone calls it generalization training, but I don't really think it's much of a training. So if you remember in the beginning, when I was telling you how to select a competing response, I said that they should be context related. This is because habits are best established within specific confines, so in a certain context. Once you establish a competing response, let's say where you watch TV or in bed or in the bathroom or whatever, you can slowly take it out of that context and see where else it works. The reason why we start with one context is to establish it as a good habit, and also to make sure to select something that actually works. But then once it's established, you can see where else it works. That's actually how habit reversal training was developed. Like, it was developed for one thing, and then once it was shown to work, it was kind of slowly applied to other things. So this is something that we use in psychology all the time. For example, DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, was developed specifically initially to treat certain forms of suicidal behaviors and borderline personality disorder. And then it was empirically validated for that. And then slowly it was kind of spread out and applied to different things as well. But it was first firmly established in one area. So the same goes for this. Once you establish your new habits in specific contexts, slowly take them out. Also, make sure to comply with everything else that you incorporate. So your awareness training techniques, your relaxation techniques, make sure that you're analyzing your resistances and all those aspects where you might fall behind. So that would be the generalization stage. It's kind of maintenance stage. If you're introducing yoga or mindfulness practice, make sure that you keep advancing. So you can start with 5 minutes of mindfulness, but this is not mindfulness. It's like you need more. So every week, increase a little bit more, try different techniques, and also keep it active and keep it fresh. And of course, practice, practice, practice endlessly. Okay, so this would be the basic stages and the basic procedure for habit reversal training. You may have noticed that I didn't include any timelines. This is because, like, when you have a structured program like SkinPick, there's usually a timeline that you work with, or at least, let's say, the minimal timeline. We can always, of course, stretch it out for each client individually. When you do it yourself, the only one that I think is really good to stretch out is the awareness training. Everything else, you can kind of work at whatever pace you like. So let me just say a few words about HRT in the SkinPick program, and then we'll proceed. So it's a part of the program, but it's not the whole program. In fact, it's less than half of the program. So first 3 sessions are officially habit reversal training. You do awareness training for 2 weeks, and at this, while you're kind of monitoring yourself and learning about triggers, you're communicating with your therapist and trying to clarify what is it that you're actually finding. So what are your logs telling you? And then in week 3, you start choosing competing response and stimulus control techniques and then implementing them. I said that this is only a part of the program. And if you remember in the beginning, I told you that habit reversal is often combined with other forms of psychotherapy. In SkinPick, it's acceptance and commitment therapy and mindfulness that we add on top of habit reversal training. Also, the self-monitoring logs that we use to learn about triggers and different aspects of the picking process, we also use later on in therapy to learn more about sort of what's the psychological backbone of the problem and to kind of give you more insight into why is it you're picking. So that's something else that you can also maybe do on your own, but this is something that maybe we can devote another webinar to, like how to extract more psychologically meaningful data from your self-monitoring logs. And so if you're working alone and you don't have a therapist, if you have a therapist, even if you're not using SkinPick, your therapist can be an ally here. Even if your therapist doesn't know much about skin picking, if you've chosen a good therapist, they're probably willing to learn, so they can actually work with you and alongside you and help you through the process. But if you are working alone, first use the SkinPick app. It's free, it's simple to use, so there's no reason really not to use it for self-monitoring. And also you have a lot of predefined fields, so you pretty much know what is it you should pay attention to from the very beginning. So you have a kind of structure there already. When you do self-monitoring in whatever way you've chosen to do it, log in real time as much as you can. It's not as effective to wait until, let's say, you're going to bed to then log your picking from 10 hours ago. If you have no choice, then I guess you have to settle with that. That's okay too. But that's absolutely not the best way to go about it. When you log as you notice yourself picking, when you immediately start logging, you get better data. Because when you log a few hours later, you might remember, for example, that you were in the kitchen or that you were talking to your mom or whatever. So you will remember the external part. That's easy to remember. But what you will likely forget is what you were thinking about and what you were feeling. And if you remember, those are really important things to know. At the end of the day, the reason why even these external things trigger you is precisely because of what they mean to you, meaning how you think about them and how you feel about them. So remembering the external events is only always half of the story. And also when you log a few hours later, what I usually get when you send me your logs to review and analyze with you is a lot of very vague terms. Things like, I felt uncomfortable. If this is not your first webinar, you probably know that basically a part of me dies every time someone says they feel uncomfortable, because that is the vaguest thing anyone can possibly say about their internal world. I felt uncomfortable basically means anything from my chair was not the most comfortable chair ever to I felt like I was going to die. So it's like vaguely negative experience. So it's not very informative. Also, when you focus on what you feel in your body, you're much more likely to give me an accurate description if you immediately write down. So you notice yourself picking, you take the app or a pen and paper, whatever, and then you write, okay, so I feel, let's say, squeezing in my chest, or I feel tension in my shoulders, or so that's the information that you will likely forget afterwards. And also, when you do it immediately, you know what to do. So you know that you need to check in with how you feel, check in with what you're thinking. So it kind of gives you a better experience. And also, like the intentionality and the structure of the process will teach you how to examine your experience more systematically. So don't rely on your memory. And the reason why I always talk about journaling is precisely don't rely on your memory. When it comes to sort of the human psyche, we're not really very reliable witnesses to ourselves. We're likely to forget things that we don't like to remember. We're very likely to remember what we want to remember. So that means that you're never going to get the full picture. And if you remember previously, I talked about resistance and how important it is to identify it. Well, resistance can really trick you if you don't have sort of kind of hard proof of something. One of the reasons I actually started really liking my work at SkinPick is because the program is done in writing. When you talk to someone, when you come back, to the next session, you can easily just and conveniently forget everything you don't like to remember. But when you send a message to your therapist, it's there and it's written. So you and your therapist can always scroll up and see what you've been talking about, and then it's really much more difficult to suppress things. Like the written aspect of it gives you accountability immediately. So this is why journals are really important. Also, however you decide to do awareness training and analyze your success with techniques, specify the time when you will sit down and review what you've been journaling about. So ideally, you can do it weekly, let's say like Sunday morning or Sunday evening. Take 1 hour to review your journals and then journal about your review journals. So this is a good way to identify patterns. What you will not notice every day, you will more easily notice when you flip through 1 week's worth of data. Weekly is the best. If you're busy, then I guess once in 2 weeks is also fine. Also, if you can find someone to go through the process with you, that's really great. I mentioned accountability partners in awareness training, and so how people around you can help you become more aware of picking. But what I mean here is something else. If you know someone who struggles with picking as well, like they can be an excellent accountability partner because they probably understand more or less what your struggle is about. Of course, the details are different for every person, but certain common things you will probably have experienced already. So you will have a kind of understanding, and you also probably know how to support that person, and that person knows how to support you. So there's less explaining to do, and there's also more understanding by default. Because our partners, cousins, friends, they really do love us, but they sometimes might be frustrated with certain things that we cannot change fast enough or in the way that they like. And when someone also has a similar struggle, they're more likely to understand that you're already extremely frustrated and you cannot just stop, under quotation marks. So they're more likely to understand you, accept you, and then make it feel like it's okay if you fail sometimes. So they kind of alleviate the guilt and the shame and all of that. So if you know people that have a similar struggle, like maybe not necessarily with skin picking, but some sort of BFRB or something similar, they tend to be great accountability partners because you can both keep yourself accountable, but also provide the comfort that you need. Otherwise, if you have a therapist, again, that's about as good as you can go with an accountability partner. Even if your therapist is not necessarily specifically trained to deal with speaking, they can provide support. Whoops, my apologies. Something very weird happened. I hope you can see the screen. I don't know what this was. Okay, so, well, that's about it. I think the app told me to stop. So without rambling any further, let's see. Oh yeah, one more thing. Limitations of habit reversal training. Also, I have to say, I once bid at this lithograph at an auction, and it was sold in front of me for much more than I could pay for it, and it's so beautiful. So what are the limitations of habit reversal training? So it's basically just a tool for behavioral modification. Habit reversal training doesn't treat any underlying causes. It offers zero psychological insight. The materials that you will gather, so all your logs and journal entries and your thoughts, all this is extremely valuable, and you can get really beautiful, deep, important insights by analyzing them. Habit reversal training, however, doesn't really care about this. Habit reversal training is about changing the habit itself. What the habit does, what the meaning of it is, what its importance is in your life, this is not something that you can understand or work through using habit reversal training. This is precisely why in SkinPick they add acceptance and commitment therapy and mindfulness, and why other therapists will add something else. If you're only interested in replacing picking, so eliminating the behavior, this is a good, reliable tool. I have noticed sometimes, and this is not a warning, but it is something that you should be mindful of. I've noticed in some cases when people do really well with habit reversal training, because it is not the easiest thing to do, but it is simple enough. And if you're just compliant, try hard, you will very likely really benefit from it. I've noticed that sometimes once people start dealing with BFRBs, another symptom might show up. Chances are they're performing the same function only in a different way. So for example, just recently, I had a client who, that wasn't a problem with skin picking, to be honest, it was hair pulling, but it's the same kind of body focused repetitive behavior, and I used habit reversal training. So once they slowed down with pulling and got that under control, they occasionally started having panic attacks. So the anxiety, and this was also a client that said, look, I don't really care about this psychology, touchy-feely stuff. I just want to get rid of my problem. But then basically because the underlying cause, which was anxiety in that particular case, it wasn't really addressed. It just found another outlet. I've also seen on occasion that once people deal with skin picking, like let's say the major aspects of skin picking, they will notice that they maybe bite their lips, for example, because most competing responses will not cover biting your lips, right? You need a whole different class of competing responses. So sometimes it happens that once you deal with one set of behaviors, something else might show up. This is not something to be panicked about, and it's not necessarily something worse, and it's not necessary that this will happen, but this is just something to be mindful of. Because I think this is when these limitations of habit reversal training really sort of come to the surface. So it's a good tool, but it's not the all-powerful solution for everything. And